The hallway outside the apostolic palace was thick with silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that comes before judgment. Shadows clung to the ancient stone like secrets refusing to die. And in the stillness, the footsteps came. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle moved swiftly, robes sweeping the floor like crimson waves. His face was tight with resolve, but beneath that mask, calculation. This was not a man coming for conversation. This was a confrontation long rehearsed in private fury, now brought into the sacred halls of power. The guards didn't stop him. They didn't need to. They had seen these kinds of men before, men who mistook applause for truth. Inside, the chamber was bare. No court, no crowd, no throne. Pope Leo XIV sat alone at a plain wooden table, back straight, hands folded, eyes cast down. A single crucifix hung above him, its shadow long and deliberate. He did not rise when the cardinal entered. He did not even blink. Tagle did not waste time. "You summoned me," he said. The Pope's eyes lifted slowly. There was no anger in them, no pride, only something deeper, something old, something like grief. "You were never dismissed," the Pope said. His voice was soft, but each word carried weight, like a stone falling into deep water. "You were unmasked." Tagle's confidence faltered, not visibly, not yet, but the air changed. A draft moved through the chamber, cold and ancient. It was the kind of cold that reminded proud men they were still mortal. In that instant, the confrontation shifted. The man who came to accuse now stood accused, not by decree, not by anger, but by something far more terrifying. Truth without ornament. What happened next? What was said? What was revealed? Never reached the cameras, never made it into press releases. But those who were in the building that day would remember the silence that followed for the rest of their lives. And still to this day, many wonder, why did Pope Leo XIV really send Cardinal Tagle away? Was it punishment, protection, or something far more prophetic? But before we open that door, before we step into the hidden room, where reputations died and something sacred survived, ask yourself, why are you watching? If you believe the Church still has secrets to tell, then you already know what to do. And if you don't, ask yourself why you're still here. Then tell the rest of us in the comments. We'll be listening. He'd been called many things. The survivor pope, the watchman of the South, the reluctant lion. But among those who truly knew him, those who had walked beside him through the jungles of Peru and the slums of Buenos Aires, he was simply known as Padre Leo. Pope Leo XIV had not risen through charm or patronage. His hands bore the cracked skin of manual labor. His voice, though now measured and slow, had once cried over mass graves in silence, for fear that grief might awaken soldiers who would not hesitate to add more. He had not sought the papacy. In truth, he had avoided it. But destiny, it seemed, doesn't need an invitation, only a wound deep enough to echo. Years ago, he had served among the forgotten, mission posts where electricity flickered and gunfire replaced bells. He walked barefoot not as an act of theater, but because the children he served had no shoes. When political storms swept through South America, many bishops spoke. He remained silent, not from fear, but from something harder, restraint. He believed that words meant nothing, if they cost nothing. By the time the conclave called his name, he was already too tired to celebrate. But perhaps that is why they chose him. In a world addicted to performance, Leo XIV carried the weary stillness of a man who no longer sought applause. Then there was Cardinal Tagle. Luis Antonio Tagle was everything Leo was not. Smiling, media-savvy, articulate, modern. He danced in interviews. He wept on camera. He quoted tweets as easily as scripture. To many, he was the future of the Church, a bridge between tradition and progress, East and West, youth and institution. His sermons filled auditoriums. His image adorned charity posters. But in the quiet corridors of Rome, murmurs grew. They said he was too close to the powers of the West, that he received more invitations from diplomats than from dying parishes, that his gospel was one of comfort, not confrontation. He called it transparency. His critics called it vanity. Leo had watched him for years, never speaking against him publicly, never undermining his rise, but always watching, because Leo knew the cost of proximity to power. He had watched too many men forget the scent of the poor. Once they had tasted prestige, their rift was quiet, almost invisible, like a fault line beneath polished stone. But when Tagle's name began circulating as a possible successor, the ground began to tremble. It wasn't about disagreement anymore. It was about legacy, about what kind of church would be handed to the next generation. And more than that, it was about trust. And so, behind sealed Vatican doors, no press, no transcripts, no echoes, Leo summoned him, not for judgment, not for trial, but for truth. The tribunal chamber was unlike the ornate halls of the papal palace. No gold, no tapestries, just stone, wood, and silence. It was the kind of room where lies sounded louder, and the soul felt heavier. Here, power was not displayed. It was tested. The air inside felt centuries old, as if it remembered confessions long buried. Cardinal Tagle stood at one end, Leo XIV at the other. No witnesses, no protection, just two men, and the consequence of everything they had become. This wasn't about power. This was about legacy, loyalty, and betrayal. And before we take another step into that room, you need to decide something. If you believe silence isn't always holy, if you believe some wounds need to be uncovered, not explained away, then subscribe to Holy Shadows now. And if you won't, if you hesitate, go on, tell us why in the comments. But be honest, we'll wait. The cardinal did not sit. He stood with the practiced posture of a man used to podiums, not confessionals. His voice, when it came, was smooth, measured as sound respectful, but hung like a blade meant to cut beneath robes and titles. Your Holiness, he began, why this secrecy? His tone implied more than the words. Behind the question was an accusation, and behind the accusation, something colder, suspicion masked as diplomacy. Pope Leo XIV did not move. He let the silence stretch, just long enough for the walls to feel it. The cardinal continued, pacing now, like a professor in control of a lecture. Your methods of late have confused many. Private dismissals, unannounced investigations, bishops removed without explanation. Even now, this meeting, no advisors, no transparency. Forgive me, but where's the synodality we were promised? Leo's eyes lifted, not to the man, but to the crucifix above him. When he finally spoke, it was not to defend himself, but to restore the order of things. Unity without obedience, he said slowly, is chaos. Obedience without love is tyranny. Tagle's smile flickered, half smug, half incredulous. And which one are you? He asked, the words feathered with irony. Leo did not blink. His gaze stayed fixed on the figure above, the tortured Christ, arms stretched wide, not in triumph, but surrender. I serve neither, he said. I serve the cross. The words fell like a stone in deep water. No echo. Just wait. Tagle broke the silence first, with a dismissive nod. That line will make headlines. But the Pope's expression didn't change. There was no performance in him, only gravity. You mistake clarity for spectacle, Leo replied, and headlines for history. The temperature in the room dropped. Not literally. Spiritually, something unspoken moved between them. A reminder that not all authority comes from visibility. Tagle's face hardened just slightly. He wasn't used to being deflected so effortlessly. He had come to corner a man he believed. Outdated, obstructive, even dangerous. But he was beginning to realize. The Pope was not cornered. He was rooted. And roots do not flinch when the wind rises. This was no longer a polite dialogue. It was a chess match, played in scripture, memory, and silence. And the room itself, bare as it was, seemed to lean in, as if even the stone wished to hear what would come next. If you feel the weight of what these words mean, if you understand that I serve the cross is not a metaphor, but a wound carried in silence, press that subscribe button now. And if it doesn't move you, if this doesn't stir anything deeper than opinion, then say so in the comments. Tell us why the shadows don't speak to you. But know this, Someone else will be reading, and they just might understand what you cannot. The cardinal's hands, folded neatly before him moments earlier, now moved with more force, gesturing, slicing the air, as if clarity could be achieved through volume and repetition. "Your Holiness," he said, his voice tightening, "you've sidelined bishops without due process. You've silenced voices crying for transparency. You've courted silence when the world begged for clarity. Abuse survivors have written you. They've begged, and your only answer was quiet retreats and closed-door purges." He took a breath and stepped forward, not with reverence, but with entitlement. "You speak of unity, but you've shown favoritism toward those who protect your vision, not the people's wounds. And let's not pretend. The Church sees which regimes you meet with and which ones you avoid. Your refusal to act, your silence, has made you complicit." There it was, the word, complicit. It hovered in the air, heavy with accusation. In most rooms, it would have ignited argument. But here, it did something else. Pope Leo XIV did not react. Not with outrage, not with rebuttal, but something shifted in his voice. Not the volume, the temperature. He looked at Tagle, not with anger, but with a kind of pity, too deep to show on the surface. "Do you want to know what complicity looks like?" he said quietly. "It looks like me at 27, holding my mentor's cassock, as I tore it from his back. The same cassock he wore when he baptized me, the same cassock he stained." He stood now, not dramatically, but deliberately. "I've washed blood from chapel floors, Cardinal, the kind of blood that doesn't come off with holy water. I've stood over a boy's body in Lima, 5 minutes after he hung himself in the vestry. I've read his note. I've memorized his handwriting." He looked down for a long moment, then back up, this time, not to Tagle, but to the silence behind him, to the centuries. "You think in hashtags," Leo said. "I've lived with screams." Tagle shifted, his spine straightened, but not in defiance, in discomfort. For the first time, since stepping into the room, he looked unsure, as if something inside him recognized the edge of a truth. He wasn't ready to enter, but Leo wasn't finished. "You love justice," he said, "but justice without suffering is a lie." There was no thunder in his voice, no moral grandstanding, only the kind of authority that can't be taught or claimed, only born. "The Church is not a podium. It is a wound, and every time you speak, as if it is a movement, or a platform, or a brand, you reopen that wound and call it renewal." Tagle didn't speak, because there are moments, rare moments, when even words betray the speaker. The room settled into a quiet. That wasn't peace. It was reckoning. This was not a political debate. This was a reckoning between image and incarnation, between those who wear the cloth and those who carry the cross. If you believe leadership must carry scars, not slogans, then subscribe now to Holy Shadows. And if you don't, if this feels too raw, too real, then say it in the comments. But ask yourself, what truth are you running from? And whose silence are you mistaking for safety? Tagle's composure cracked like glass under pressure. His breath caught in his throat, not from fatigue, but fury. His words sharpened, no longer veiled in diplomacy or tradition. "Then why dismiss me?" he snapped. "Was I too loud for your shadows?" The question didn't seek an answer. It accused. It blamed. It presumed. But Pope Leo XIV didn't rise to meet the volume. He didn't scold or defend. He didn't even look at the cardinal at first. Instead, he turned his back to the room, walked to a side cabinet, and opened a narrow wooden drawer that groaned under age. From within, he withdrew a single sheet of paper, folded, handwritten, weathered by time, and faintly creased at the corners. He held it up, but did not wave it. He simply let the silence gather around it. Then he read aloud, not a mockery, but with the quiet authority of remembrance. "Your Holiness," he began, "I have grown tired, disillusioned, weighed down by expectations. I can no longer fulfill with joy. Perhaps a new season awaits the Church, one that I may no longer be called to lead." Tagle froze. Leo lowered the paper, eyes now locked on him. "You asked to resign," he said softly. "You just didn't expect me to accept." The blow didn't strike like thunder. It felt like ice. And in that stillness, a different kind of story began to emerge. One that lived beneath the headlines and beyond the photo shoots. One a man who had not been silenced, but who had first whispered his own weariness into the dark, hoping no one would hear. The flashback unfolded, not in time, but in tone. Tagle months earlier, alone in his study, pen trembling in hand, his words cautious, polished, but bleeding through. He wrote of burdens, of directional dissonance, of questioning his place in the current rhythm of the church. He used phrases like, discerning a step back, but his ambition flickered between the lines, like a candle near extinction. He had offered his resignation, wrapped in humility, hoping perhaps it would be declined, hoping it would be interpreted as modesty, a political signal, a move on the chessboard. But Leo XIV didn't play chess with the soul. He took the resignation as it was, a truth too uncomfortable to admit in daylight, but too revealing to ignore. I dismiss no one, the Pope said, but I will not canonize confusion. He returned the letter to the table, then walked slowly back to his seat. And then he said it, the line that would echo in Tagle's heart for years to come. You call it betrayal. I call it mercy. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room did the rest. Because in that moment, Cardinal Tagle wasn't just outmaneuvered. He was unmasked. Every headline that praised his humility, every voice that said he was the future, every whisper that claimed he was silenced, now trembled beneath the reality. He had walked into a room, hoping to expose someone, and found himself exposed. The silence that followed was not just absence of sound. It was judgment deferred. It was grace withheld, just long enough to reveal the weight of what had been done. Pope Leo XIV didn't look at Tagle as a rival. He looked at him as a man who had once believed, once burned for something, and now could not tell the difference between faith and applause. If you believe mercy is fiercer than judgment, if you believe it takes more strength to forgive a lie than to expose it, then subscribe to Holy Shadows. And if you don't, if you still think this was just politics wrapped in robes, tell us in the comments. Let's see if your reason can stand in the same light. Pope Leo XIV sat again, though nothing in his posture suggested retreat. If anything, he seemed taller in stillness, his voice the only movement left in the room. The paper lay before him like a confession, offered but not yet absolved. The letter, the confrontation, the years of divergence, they had all led here, to this moment of pure, surgical clarity. Then, without warning, the tone shifted, not louder, lower, slower, sharper. You assumed visibility means impact, the Pope said, but the most powerful saints were invisible. The word struck without violence, because they didn't need it. They carried the kind of weight that doesn't crash, but settles permanently. He didn't look at Tagle. He looked past him, into the air, into memory. I've known nuns who never published a word, who never spoke above a whisper, but smuggled orphan children out of war zones under their habits. I've known janitors who never took communion from the front of church, but memorized confession logs so that, when the secret police raided, they knew which names to burn. He turned his gaze slowly toward the cardinal. You confuse attention with authority, he said. You confuse applause with holiness. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even disappointment. It was something deeper, the kind of grief reserved only for those we once hoped would carry the fire, and instead chased the spotlight. Tagle didn't respond, because there was nothing to say. Behind him, even his aides had dropped their eyes. Men who had once flanked him like armor now stood disarmed, not by humiliation, but by the weight of truth. Spoken plainly, no accusation, no theatrics, just the unbearable simplicity of being known. Leo's voice, steady as ever, landed the final blow, not for destruction, but for revelation. You were never silenced, he said. You were being watched. By heaven. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was sacred. It was the kind of silence that descends at a graveside, not because someone has died, but because something false has. This wasn't a debate lost. It was a reckoning received. There would be no response, because in certain rooms, beneath certain eyes, even proud men know when to bow. If not their heads, then their illusions. The confrontation had ended, not with victory, but with truth, standing alone, unchanged by applause, untouched by ambition. If this moment hit you like a thunderclap, if something inside you fell quiet, not out of fear, but reverence, then you know what to do. Subscribe to Holy Shadows. And if it didn't, if your doubts still rattle louder than the silence that just spoke, then leave your reason in the comments. Let's speak, and we'll see who listens. Pope Leo XIV stood once more, slowly, deliberately, as though the ground itself bore witness to his rising. He didn't look at Tagle again. He didn't need to. That chapter had closed not with condemnation, but with clarity. Instead, he walked to the far side of the chamber, toward a narrow window that overlooked the city, not the marble plazas and basilicas, but the back alleys and crumbling facades that Rome preferred not to photograph. The kind of view only a man uninterested in appearances would choose. And then, without turning, he spoke, not to Tagle, not even to the room, but beyond it, through the stone, through time. This isn't about Tagle, he said. It's about all of us. The words hung there, not as excuse, but as invitation. He spoke slowly, without notes, without ceremony, like a father who had wept in secret, and finally stepped out to speak to his children. All of them, the angry, the broken, the lapsed, the exhausted, to the young priests who no longer know how to preach without fear, to the sisters who buried their joy with their youth, to the survivors still waiting for someone to knock on their door and say, "We see you," to the skeptics, the critics, the outraged, and the heartbroken. I hear you. He turned then, his face half in shadow. The church is not clean, he said, but she is ours. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't defeat. It was the hard-earned confession of a man who had seen both beauty and rot in the same pew, the same pulpit, the same face, and we will not abandon her. To the men who seek to use her as ladder or shield, he continued, this is not an institution. It is a wound that bleeds mercy. He returned to his chair, but didn't sit. His voice grew quieter now, not with fatigue, but with resolve. There will be changes, more listening posts, more public audits, more silent retreats, where power must kneel, not speak. He looked down for a moment, as if remembering the face of someone long gone. And when he spoke again, his voice cracked, not with weakness, but with weight. I do not fear the judgment of men, he said. I fear failing the orphans who still pray for bread. And just like that, the temperature of the entire story shifted. This was never about who won. It was about what must come next. A reckoning is not an end. It is a mirror, and what we do after, how we carry the silence, how we answer the cross, weighs more than any debate ever could. So if you still care about the future of the church, if you still believe that mercy is a mission, not a slogan, then join us. Subscribe to Holy Shadows. And if you've given up, if your hope is gone, say so in the comments. But do not say in silence. Not anymore. The chamber dimmed behind him, as Pope Leo XIV stepped out, robes brushing against cold stone, his face calm, not victorious, but weathered. Outside, the city stretched wide, but he walked past the balconies and courtyards, and into the margins, where the stones were chipped, and the prayers less polished. The screen narrows. A slow montage begins. He walks among tents in Lebanon, where children with no shoes clutch rosaries given by strangers. He kneels to speak with a widow in Aleppo, her voice too hoarse to cry. A boy in Sudan places a hand on his chest, not knowing his name, but knowing the crucifix around his neck. He does not bless with pomp. He listens. He holds. He stays. Across the world, a different scene. Cardinal Tagle sits alone. No microphone, no audience. Just him, and a faded chapel wall. His hands move over the edge of an unopened Bible. He stares not at the pages, but the floor. The camera lingers. He is not fallen, but something inside him has. Not pride, not career, something subtler, something called certainty. The voice returns. Not the Pope's, not Tagle's, but the one you've heard all along. What would you have said if you were in that room? Would you have defended comfort? Or would you have spoken truth, knowing it might leave you alone? Would you have asked for applause? Or would you have endured the silence? Would you have sought the light? Or followed the shadow, waiting for it to lead you there? Because truth doesn't always shine. Sometimes it waits in places we'd rather avoid. In silence, in shame, in the long corridors between power and conscience. So, if holy shadows gave you something real today, if it stirred something more than curiosity, something like conscience, then subscribe. Stay with us. Watch what comes next. And if it didn't, if you're still here, watching, doubting, resisting, tell us why in the comments. Because maybe your reason for staying says more than you think. May we all seek truth with humble hearts and follow the shadows until we find the light.